In a lot of ways, Harvey is the perfect storm. Houston, it's a low-lying city that's overdeveloped. It's got lax regulations and zoning. It's also paved over wetlands and prairies that are nature's way of absorbing water. Now you can add to that a massive hurricane that was helped by warm water, made warmer by climate change. Here is how the Atlantic describes it. Quote, storms like Harvey are helped by one of the consequences of climate change. As the air warms, some of that heat is absorbed by the ocean, which in turn raises the temperature of the sea's upper layers. Harvey benefited from unusually toasty waters in the Gulf of Mexico. As the storm roared towards Houston, sea surface waters near Texas rose. The tropical storm, feeding off this unusual warmth, was able to progress from a tropical depression to a Category 4 hurricane in roughly 48 hours. And to add to all that, you have an EPA that's led by a climate change denier now, who has been gutting the agency, and of course, his boss, a president who has in the past also denied it. In fact, just 10 days before Harvey hit, the president signed an executive order revoking Obama administration regulations protecting federally funded infrastructure projects from flooding. He nixed the rules before they even kicked in. Well, here to help us sort all this out is an environmental attorney, Michael Gerrard. He's a professor and director of the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia Law School. Thank you very much. I appreciate the time.
My pleasure.
You know, where people used to say, well, this is once in a generation or a once in a century storm. You know, you look to the Atlantic now, you see Irma bearing down, certainly the Caribbean, and potentially it could build into a Category 4, even coming up towards the Gulf again, or certainly along Florida, and you realize there's a new normal going out there. Are we equipped, and is our government doing more to help or hurt the situation given our new realities?
So there were 500-year storms in Houston in 2015 and 2016, and now in 2017. We're hoping that 2018 breaks the streak, and it will be the first year in 4 without a 500-year storm. These numbers have obviously become meaningless, and we are facing a new normal in terms of the physics, although not in terms of the politics. The federal government under President Obama had been taking steps, arguably not enough, but it had been taking steps to acknowledge what was happening with the climate. The Trump administration is now affirmatively beating that back and adopting an ostrich strategy of ignoring what's happening with the climate.
You know, we saw in certain ways with Katrina, and we're seeing it now, nature's barriers, while imperfect, were at least buffers to when storms made landfall. And as we're seeing in Houston, there's less of them, and more than that, we're paving over things that we used to count on right now. It doesn't seem, given the realities of climate change, of rising water levels, of the frequency of the storms, we're actually, pouring gas in a fire, if you will, the way that we're doing urban development in these low-lying areas. We need to have a major conversation in this country when it comes to that planning, right?
That's right. Houston is famously the only major in the city that doesn't have zoning. And so, lacking zoning, they pave over everything in sight, and the previously pervious soils that would have, and vegetation that would absorb the water now become pavement, and it makes it even harder to prevent flooding. But even in many other areas, we continue to not only allow, but affirmatively encourage development in areas that we know are vulnerable to flooding, and that has to stop.
The executive orders that were signed, I think for my audience to go through the detail of it, maybe some of their eyes will glaze over, but the net thrust of this, you'd agree, is that it wasn't by any means draconian what the previous administration had put in for some oversight here, but now to expedite it even further, and when you're given localities like we see with Houston that has no zoning, you can't leave it to independent agencies or localities to think about the greater good of a community. You have to have some level of government with some oversight that we have some coherent big picture about planning, right?
Of course, and that's especially so since many developers build their property and they sell it and they're gone. They're not looking at the long term. Even mortgage lenders, if you have a 20 or 30-year mortgage, if you think that The very bad effects are not likely to happen for a few decades after that. You can ignore that. People who are buying houses don't often look 20, 30, 40 years in the future. We need government to step in and require at a minimum disclosure. You know, one thing that is not widely known is that the flood maps that are issued by FEMA are purely backward looking. They only look at what the historical flooding experience has been. They don't take any account at all of what the trends are or what the future is likely to be, and therefore people buy in places that are not mapped as flood areas, but are now known to be vulnerable, but the maps haven't caught up.
Michael, let me take a stab here and actually try and take a positive or a hopeful look here. You have a president who wants to do infrastructure. You have a Congress, or at least one party, that certainly seems open to it, and other members within his own party who seem, obviously with a ton of contingencies, price tags, and how it's paid for. But nonetheless, if there was a conversation to say, look, we have a new reality here. We'll need to talk about seawalls. We'll need to talk about rebuilding at elevations. We need to mandate when we build stuff there, it has to be on higher levels, or at least, X height minimums if we're going to do anything. What would drive that? Would some of the insurance realities or the federal outlays for the storm that we're seeing right now playing out on those poor folks in Texas? Is there a fact that, forget morality, right and wrong, the pure economics will say we can't keep doing this way, especially if this happens every year? We're going to have huge budgetary consequences.
Any rational economic analysis would consider that the federal government is going to have to spend at least tens of billions of dollars on rebuilding Houston and the other affected areas. The amount of expenditure would be smaller if the construction had been done in a way that reflects the climate realities. Going forward, it would be insane for President Trump's executive order to prevent consideration of future climate risks in the federal expenditure. It's like somebody going into a hospital for lung cancer treatment, and after the treatment, on the way out, they give him a carton of cigarettes. What you want to do is to prevent a recurrence of what happened before. And so the only rational thing is to consider these future flood risks. For residential houses, we have the perverse incentive of the flood insurance program subsidizing redevelopment in areas that continue to be subject to these risks, and that too has to be changed.
Well, hopefully at least we'll start to have a rational conversation about the reality and a little bit less of the rhetoric. But Michael Gerrard, I certainly appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, everyone, coming up next, we'll take a look at some local headlines, so stay with us.